The council's called back into order. If you would take your seats, please. Dr. Norgard, if you'd be good enough to join us up here, please. Okay. Dr. Norgard, of course, is the chair of the Delta Independent Science Council, and we are deeply grateful you could catch an earlier train and get here and get on time. And we actually accelerated your presentation, and Doctor, I appreciate very much you could do that.
Thank you. Appreciate those congratulations, but I actually held my ground. I was at a point where I could have jumped in my car and driven like crazy and been here by 11:45 and said, no, you guys deserve lunch. But I held my environmental grounds and said, I'm going to ride the train and not burn fuel. And so thank you for having a good lunch. It's been a while since I've spoken before you, and I'm pleased to be here again. I'm speaking now for 3 meetings. Early July, late July, we had a teleconference and another meeting in person in mid-August. And we'll be having another meeting in about 3 weeks. We were able to cancel a teleconference call, so could have been 4 meetings I was going to be reporting on. I'm going to just speak to the meetings, not in terms of what happened on which days, but sort of what fronts we're working on. And we're definitely making progress on the issue of how to review science programs. I think several times I've spoken before you saying, we're really perplexed. We've got big programs, little programs, maybe 80 to 100 in all. And the legislation says in support of adaptive management, and since we didn't find any programs that were really doing adaptive management, we could say we didn't have to review any programs. Or we're at this other extreme of a lot of little programs, or there are some obvious clusters. And then as we started to think about the clusters and how we could get more clusters, it was, well, what's the question that clusters these scientific programs that we're looking for? And finally we just gave up, said, let's not think about scientific programs, what are the big questions? And I met with Alf Brandt to sort of say what was the intention of the legislation. And, it was a little disconcerting that, we just thought the Science Board ought to help spur along adaptive management. We didn't really think you were supposed to review each program each 5 years. If you read the legislation, it looks like we have to do each program every 5 years. And so I said, well, what if we just start raising big questions and seeing how far we are along in answering the big questions? And he said, oh, fine, no problem. And so that went over with the board, because the board was also, as we sort of backed off and said, if we're going to cluster these around questions, we ought to start to think about the questions. If you're talking about adaptive management, you're talking about dynamics and change, and obviously the biggest one we're facing is climate change. But there are other stressors that are changing over time. But we kind of said, let's definitely say we want to review programs, not in terms of the immediate reactions and responses, but their ability to think in longer term frames and how well they're actually setting themselves up to change as new scientific information comes along and as other factors in the environment change. So then we started to say, what's the clusters? And of course we looked to the wisdom of the council and found that the chapters of the Delta Plan seemed to lay out some of the biggest issues that we're facing. And so we said, let's see what the science is behind those chapters. We ended up with habitat restoration in light of climate change, but other stressors as well, is the first big question we're asking. How well is Delta science, wherever we find it, addressing habitat restoration in a changing environment? We're then looking at water reliability and climate change, but other stressors as well. Food webs and flow, and that will pick up the interagency ecological program, but we didn't want to just say we're going to review the interagency ecological program. We wanted to cluster around it, so we were sure to pick up other things as well. We're then looking at risk, and levee risk in particular, and climate change, nutrients and contaminants, and the delta as a place. And the last one, of course, is where we need the most science, because it is such an abstract bundle of things. And yet, we are still sort of weighing the delta as place and water reliability, where we can get some really hard science. So the question is, how well can we really understand the delta as place in a rapidly changing environment? We are also progressing on how we're going to review the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, the EIR. Unfortunately, to read the EIR, you really need to read the plan. It's a lot of reading. And so we decided to do a practice run. And we basically assigned chapters to each of our members, or some members bravely said they'll read more chapters than they possibly could and discovered their limits. But we went through the administrative draft and sort of said, let's do a trial run. What can we, how much can we really tolerate? And what are we going to be able to say? So we've begun our discussions on how we're going to review the plan and the ER, and what other expertise we're going to need in addition to that, and working with the Delta Science Plan on that additional expertise when, in fact, we see a EIR. Along those lines, the board has sent a letter to Jerry Merrill saying the EIR chapters really need syntheses, something that can be read in 2 or 3 pages, because a 200 to 300 page chapter, which many of them are, is just more than you expect people to read. At least you need a synthesis up front, so you know where you want to dig into that chapter. We think we're pushing them hard enough on that, but we will push them some more. We are also pushing BDCP on their science plan and how they think science in support of BDCP is going to mesh with the science plan that the Delta Science Program will be preparing, is beginning to prepare now. And Jerry and I will be meeting on that, and we'll be continuing to pressure how does BDCP science fit with the bigger picture of science. How can we make it all work together as effectively as possible? The board has changed its modus operandi and not totally revamped it, but added a new element on. And I think we kind of got a little bit into a trap, but partly because the CalFed Independent Science Board was a little bit in a trap. But the trap of sitting in a room and having the scientists come to us, having people testify to us, having books and reports in front of us, instead of getting out and going to the scientists themselves, getting out to the Delta and looking at restoration projects, going to the science conference, many of our members do, going to some of the workshops that the Delta Science Program holds. And so at the August meeting, as we began to move into what are we really learning about habitat restoration, we also split our board into groups of 2. Groups of 2 are no longer public meetings, and so we didn't have to have public joining us. And in groups of 2, we went into some of the state agencies and talked about habitat restoration, coming back again, summarizing it in the public forum and discussing what we were learning. We will do this again with the federal agencies in our November meeting. Our October meeting is just one day after the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday science conference. We're encouraging all of our members to be at the science conference. They're not paid at the science conference, but their airfares are already covered, and the additional cost of the additional days will be covered. And similarly, our January meeting will be held in coordination with a workshop at Davis. So we'll be getting board members to that workshop. So we can't just say science is a practice. We have to sort of become involved in the practice ourselves. Part of it, of course, is calling people in front of you and having people testify as scientists, but part of it is seeing science working, and the board is moving into that mode, partly because that's the best way to really get into the science, partly because we also then want to be able to advise on the development of the Delta Science Plan and review it in its entirety when it does come out. In addition, we will soon be reviewing the Delta Science Program's strategic plan that's about to be sent to 3 of our members. We're hoping those 3 will be able to report at the October meeting, certainly by the November meeting. So we'll be providing feedback on that. I think there's only one other thing just to open up the conversation. We continue to sort of just try to keep abreast of the key issues. There was for example, a relatively recent NRC, Natural Research Council report on sea level rise in the West Coast. And this was a report that was actually somewhat instigated by a CalFred concern with sea level rise coming out of the IPCC's 4th assessment, which was out of phase with the science that was known at the time. And then that led to a Schwarzenegger initiative, or whatever saying all agencies need to plan for X level to sea level rise. I believe that was 50.
There was also an officious intermeddler on the Delta Vision Task Force that pushed for that.
There was. And so we now have all state agencies dealing with coastlines prepared for 55-inch sea level rise over the next century. But one of the things that came out of that was that the West Coast governors asked the NRC to have more specific recommendations about sea level rise on the West Coast. We did review that report, and the West Coast turns out is different than other places in the world just because of the dynamics of ocean currents that push water onto our shores, which could change, and a few other factors. And they projected somewhat higher sea level rises on the West Coast over the next 100 years, up to 1.6 meters, which I think is 75 inches or so. No, 73 inches, but somewhere in there. So we're still, I think our directive is still appropriate, but it's something that we need to just keep watching out for. Okay, so that's a quick overview of our activities and the major directions we're going, and I'm open to questions.
Okay. Questions from members? Randy? Joe, you had a question? You were leaning forward.
I was just remembering the Delta Vision Task Force pushing the Schwarzenegger administration persistently.
Yes.
We actually had the governor agreeing to issue 55 inches by the year 2100 as a planning requirement for state agencies, not mandating it on anybody else. And then his, I don't know who it was, ledge secretary or something, decided that there should be another study because certain interest would object to that. And now, of course, all the studies seem to be upping the ante on the top range, which makes a 55-inch thing look conservative.
In 5 years, climate change has changed a lot. It's coming at us much faster than we expected.
Okay. All right. Any questions? Let's see. You've got a new member who will be sworn in or has been sworn in already?
Yes, Joe Fernandez.
But he'll attend the next meeting coming up.
He'll be attending our October meeting. Jay and Jeff Jay London and Jeff Mount will just be
a lateral
coming
between.
Going,
Yes,
and
right.
They don't have to change offices at Davis, but they're next to each other anyway. So that change will be very smooth.
And then Mr. Knopf and I will be, I think, together at your next meeting. That'll be a chance for him to say hello to, if he's available, if your schedule's available, to all the ISB members.
Hoping we can introduce you October 19th.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Okay.